When it comes to this section, there's two giant cards that have often been pulled out with regards to it. One, the film is too long, shallow, and stuff needed to be cut. And two, it's tonally inconsistent between being serious and then being humorous, thus making it an awkward experience. While the latter does have some slight legs, the former I completely disagree with. Well, most of it anyway, and I feel that this is born more of people being sold one type of movie through trailers and advertising, and less on the film itself being badly or ineptly made. In contrast to most critics and a good portion of you watching this video, I vehemently disagree with the claim that the segments involving old Tonto and the boy in the 1930s are completely perfunctory, for one very simple reason. They're the film's central idea, and in fact it's kind of ironic that this film wasn't the one that was called Legend of the Lone Ranger, because that's what it's ultimately about. It's a story about stories, or rather legends and the way they are born, and I find it really amusing that the film is being criticized for the very thing it's talking about. Tonto here isn't just some kooky old man telling a kid a story. Rather, throughout, Tonto is incorporating elements from what's around him in the museum and fitting them into the story, such as a bag of peanuts that Tonto uses to bless one of the dead rangers out in the desert, and the kid is often questioning them or asking Tonto what they have to do with the story or how certain events were even possible, rather than just being a wide-eyed passive observer. Even one of the film's closing lines, when the kid asks Tonto if what he said was true and Tonto replies, "You decide," indicates very clearly what the film is saying. It's about storytelling and imagination, which applies actually to another theme of the film that I'll address in a bit, and how it can be distorted or altered by those who tell it. There's a very famous saying associated with westerns: "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." This of course isn't all that new, as the man who shot Liberty Valance used a similar idea of a fish out of water guy who ends up becoming famous for something he never actually did, and many anti-westerns of the 60s and 70s also sought to demystify the West, such as Once Upon a Time in the West, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and Little Big Man, to name a few, showing it as a much harsher, more morally ambiguous place, and the heroes as far more complicated and less saintly individuals. However, here this all has a bigger, more special significance. The Lone Ranger character was very much born of the more glamorous black hats, white hats kind of West that was the popular view of it, not just in older films, but in much of America's own mythology and fiction at the time he was created. He was a straightforward, clean-cut good guy who righted wrongs and marauded the Western Plains, a la the way John Wayne and Randall Scott, among many others, would become famous for in a lot of classic Hollywood Westerns. When putting all these elements together, the unreliable narrator who is passing on an old story to another person, a character that symbolizes a simplified, cleaner West, and then placing him in a story and with a supporting cast rooted in a much grittier, dirtier, meaner, darker West, akin to the works of Sergio Leone, you have a film that seeks to question and peel back the very nature of the legends of the Old West and how they are created. Babinski and Bruckheimer have talked many times about how they viewed this story. Taking a character from an older, cleaner Western, a Jimmy Stewart type as they themselves said, and then putting them in a world more like that of Sergio Leone or Clint Eastwood, where the straightforward black and white rules of the former simply don't and can't work, and then seeing what would happen. Tonto's story is very much that, a tale of a naive man from one world trying to keep those values and apply them to a world that simply can't play by them, and in the end having to adapt and rise to the challenge, thereby becoming something more and ultimately becoming a legend, a symbol of ideals that contrasts with the actual reality of the world it came from. In so doing, the telling is more important than what's being told. Once again, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. This also in part helps explain and even clear some of the choices the film makes, since we're not only being told this from the perspective of a very old and unreliable narrator like Tonto, but also because he's merging these two very different sides of the Western into one, and as a product, familiar imagery and icons that we recognize that in one were straightforward and clean cut, become truncated, altered and twisted by being mixed with the other. Silver, for example, the Ranger's trusty steed, has more of an oddball personality and self-awareness. doing things like drinking beer or climbing up trees that you wouldn't normally see with the standard portrayal of heroic horses in westerns. The bandits here are not just mustachioed Mexicans or muscular meatheads, but they come from very different backgrounds and ages, and even incorporate other elements such as cannibalism and transvestialism or cross-dressing as part of their reputation and their personalities. Not something entirely uncommon among both anti-westerns and the real history of the Old West, given that it was a huge melting pot of people, beliefs and cultures during the various land and gold rushes, as well as the large-scale use of cheap immigrant labor when building these towns and railroads, seen here in the form of the Chinese miners who dig for silver, and again, something not seen in a lot of the more sanitized views of the West. Even something as trivial and benign as cute little rabbits aren't safe from this inversion of the familiar, becoming vampiric and taking on traits of their frontier cohabitants like wolves and coyotes, which, by the way, I can't help but get the feeling was on some level a nod to this. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the film's sense of humor does definitely have a strong flavor akin to that, and in fact more akin towards the work of a man involved with that show, Terry Gilliam, whose films often have that combination of the absurd and the macabre when it comes to their humor, and in particular, when I was thinking about it, Adventures of Baron Munchausen, my personal favorite film of his next to Brazil by the way, and Tideland came to my mind. Baron Munchausen for its Python-style gags, which are by and large very visual and often poke fun at the absurdities of the genre that it's part of, akin to the ones in this film, and Thailand because of the dark, surreal, oddball nature of the story and aesthetic, taking mundane images like a girl playing with dolls or a girl moving house and turning it into something surreal and twisted and very unpleasant, much like this does by fusing these different sides of the Western to create its own world. The vampire rabbits and silver up in a tree in particular being an image that's right at home in any one of Terry's films. I mentioned earlier that the film's idea of imagination also plays into another key theme, which is masks. Many characters in the film use masks for different reasons, but all linked with the concept of identity. The Ranger's mask is to protect his identity and those he loves from those who are his enemies, while Tonto's is actually his whole life purpose. He creates this mask, this entire mythology around Cavendish and Cole after they massacre his village, that they are monsters, or Wendigos as he calls them, and it's his duty to hunt them and kill them with silver weaponry, and using this to try and help deal with all the pain and torment he lives with, since he's the one who inadvertently led to the situation, because as a boy he not only rescued these two men from dying in the desert, but also showed them where a vein of silver was in exchange for a gift from Cole, a silver watch, the one you probably all saw in the trailers. Furthermore, this also helps explain all the seemingly supernatural and strange things we see throughout the film as simply byproducts of Tonto's warped imagination. Cavendish's mask is one of being this powerful, intimidating monster and force of evil who does things like consume the hearts of the dead, when in actuality he's just another hired gun working for the real villain Cole, whose mask is one of being an upright citizen, an all-American patriot seeking to help his fellow man by building the Transcontinental Railroad and facilitating their travel, as well as being an older man and thus a symbol of wisdom and authority, when in reality he's only in it for personal gain and advancing his position, using the wealth from the secret silver mine and the press and glamour that comes with building something like the railroad. And in the end, it's ironically both of these that become his undoing as he goes off a cliff in the train and dies crushed under his own carts of mined silver. While I'm not saying this is deep or subtle, it is a nice touch that this was applied to several characters as opposed to just the Ranger and Cole in the standard hero and villain two sides of the same coin motif so commonly used again and again among these kinds of films. And once more, it's tying back into the whole theme of mythology and storytelling with Tonto's mask and how it gives him justification and a vessel for the inner pain that he feels. I feel that the dismissal of the film's narrative was on some level unfair, and while some ideas maybe could have been explored a little bit more or streamlined a bit, to out and out claim that the film is either wasteful, hollow, or devoid of anything meaningful or semi-interesting is simply straight up disingenuous and, dare I say, dishonest, which is not a good thing when it comes to film criticism. Remember I said I almost completely disagreed with the complaints about excessive material? Well, the elements that I concede should have been cut are more perfunctory moments or little scenes that don't really work, as opposed to what many felt should have gone. Scenes like the Ranger being dragged through Silver's freshly dumped dung while unconscious just feel cheap and uninspired compared to a lot of the more inventive gags in the film, and while it makes for some really great cinematography, the spirit platform that Reed awakens on after the ambush really adds nothing to the story thematically or in terms of narrative, because none of the other characters ever acknowledge it again or explain its purpose. There's no scene where Tonto says something like, "Oh, I put you up on Skystair to talk to Great Father," or something like that. And as a result, it wastes a minute and a half of screen time in a film that really needs to use its large runtime carefully and wisely. Plus, there are some undeniable contrivances and plot holes sprinkled here and there that I simply can't defend, such as the bank that the Ranger and Tonto rob just so happening to have Cole's supply of explosives that they then use to blow up the main bridge. Or even later, Tonto being able to land on a pile of rocks after falling from a moving train without suffering some type of injury or slowdown during the final set piece. He doesn't even grunt upon impact, he just gurns a little bit and then gets up and moves right along. I'm sorry, but even if this is being told from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, he had to have felt that when he actually did it. Also, the one time I genuinely felt a problematic tone shift that really irritated me was right after the big silver mine battle when a bunch of Comanche and US soldiers have been killed, and Reed is mediating over his failure to stop Cavendish and Cole, as well as rescue Rebecca and his nephew. But then right after we get the Gilliam-esque joke of Silver in the tree, and though I did laugh at it as a standalone joke, I felt it was just too soon to be there and it felt rushed in. The scene should have been allowed to breathe a little bit more, take it a little easier, give our two leads a moment together to really put themselves together and get themselves in the frame of mind to do something. Little scenes like that can go a long way to really helping out your characters. Furthermore, on the note of characters, I mentioned that Barry Pepper's captain suffers from an inconsistency, though it's no fault of his as he does a good job, but the film at first wants us to sympathize with him, having joined the villains under a false assumption that it was the local Native Americans who were raiding farms, whereas in reality it was the doing of Butch and his gang disguised as Comanches. And soon after, he regrets killing all those Comanches and feels the blood on his hands, and even starts panicking about what he should do. However, during the final set piece, he goes crazy and seems to relish killing and being mean towards Rebecca's son while Tonto tries to rescue him, and also tries to goofily fondle Red like a Looney Tunes character, which she uses to have him shoot a bunch of explosives with her leg as a distraction while Tonto steals the Constitution train. Though Pepper is a lot of fun to watch going completely nuts, which is one of the things he does well, it comes out of nowhere, and he behaves more like the psychotic captain from Mask of Zorro than someone who has that weight of regret on his shoulders. And finally, more scenes with Red, given how fun Helena is, but also to make her more relevant to the main narrative, and not just a tool for the use of our heroes when they are in a jam. Here is pulling for either that extended version or a ton of deleted scenes on the Blu-ray. And with that, we finally reached the conclusion of this lengthy saga of analysis, debate, and discussion. And it's probably the most I've ever had to do for any video of mine, and considering that I've been doing film criticism online for 3.5 years now, that's saying something given some of the gems and turkeys I've tackled. To conclude, Lone Ranger may not be the most groundbreaking original blockbuster, but it's certainly one of the gutsiest in a good while, taking a forgotten character in a genre way past its golden days, and then inverting all of that, playing off the myths and matinee fun of the classic West, with the grime and darkness of both the real West and the revisionist West, walking a fine line between satire and deconstruction in a grandiose and indulgent spectacle that, though it may not hit its marks consistently, when it does, it really does. And to quote Robbie Collin of the Daily Telegraph, "In a sane world, this would never have been made, although I'm really rather glad someone did." I hope I articulated myself well and made a video that was engaging regardless of which side of the fence you're on. If you still don't like the film, that's completely fine, but all I ask is that you be respectful of my view the same way I am of yours. I'm not asking for the moon here. Let's just be calm and civil about this. you'll have something to say, feel free to sound off down below. And well, till next time.
This 4th of July, celebrate the land of the free and the home of the brave with the Lone Ranger. Johnny Depp, Armie Hammer.
Just with a mask. Oh, don't answer that. Every man has his thing.
Oh, and by the way, just to quickly step out of objective mode for a moment, for those who are calling Lone Ranger the worst film of the year, watch movie 43. You'll change your mind.